Right now, 79. So, let's see. Hi, can you guys hear me? Great. Hi. No longer invisible, now more visible. I have a teaching assistant with me today. So,
Hello. Should I do an introduction of myself?
yeah, sure. So this is John.
你好，我是陈亮，然后我是在哈佛大学学习历史，然后我是 Trevor 的助教今天。
All right, cool stuff. So yeah, he'll be helping me translate. In future classes, hopefully, he'll help me be a little more involved. But for this class, he'll be helping me translate, so you guys don't have to rely on my terrible Chinese. So, in just a sec, we'll start the class. And as you should know, we'll be talking about Aristotle, which will be a ton of fun, promise. All right. Good stuff. And without any further ado, let's begin. Okay, so everyone can see the screen? You get chat. All right. I'll have to, can I share this with you? No. Thanks. All right. Cool stuff. So today we'll be talking about Aristotle. So Aristotle, as I've mentioned before in the last class, may be the most influential philosopher who ever lived. His doctrines were followed pretty closely for about 2,000 years. And they were really, they were really influential. I mean, you see various like Europeans up until like 1500, 1600 saying Aristotle discovered everything there is to know scientifically, and there's literally nothing else that can possibly be discovered. So he really has an astonishing hold on the minds of, well, pretty much all of the West for about 2,000 years. He's also sort of a strange case in that we don't follow any of his doctrines today. So if, as I said before, if we were doing a class of philosophy and I wanted to proportion sort of our class out based on how long each philosopher was regarded as like the preeminent philosopher, as the most important philosopher, Aristotle would take up 80% of the time. Except right after that, he'd go immediately down to the bottom because we really don't take him very seriously anymore. So he's very strange in that sense. Also, he writes a ton. So as you can see on my screen here, here's a bunch of books. These books are the doctrines of Aristotle. So if we're so when we're trying to cover him in a 2-hour presentation, it's quite difficult because he just wrote so much. And there's a quote from your pre-reading from Bertrand Russell that I think sums all this up pretty well. He came at the end of the creative period in Greek thought, and after his death, it was 2,000 years before the world produced any philosopher who could be regarded as approximately his equal. So if you guys understand what that means, he comes at the end of like the golden age of Greek philosophy, and then after his death, it's 2,000 years before another philosopher comes along who can really think as well as Aristotle can. Toward the end of this long period, his authority had become almost as unquestioned as that of the church, and in science as well as in philosophy, become a serious obstacle to progress. Ever since the beginning of the 17th century, almost every serious intellectual advance has had to begin with an attack on some Aristotelian doctrine. So, as Russell points out, even today, and definitely, as we'll see, 1600s, 1700s, any great philosopher is going to have to start out with a new idea by proving why Aristotle is wrong, because it is guaranteed that Aristotle has already written about this. And he might not have been correct, and he might not have even been very smart in how he went about it, but in these huge books, Aristotle definitely wrote about whatever anyone else thinks about after him. So he's really a very astonishing philosopher in a lot of ways. But we have a lot to cover and not enough time to do it. So if you guys are okay, let's move forward. All right. So Aristotle, who is this man on the right here, born in 384 BC in Greece. So if you guys remember, this is about 10, 15 years after Socrates dies. And then at the age of 18, Aristotle moves to Plato's academy. Plato, student of Socrates, he's the one who wrote the Apologia. And then as the story goes, and it's hard to get an exact history for things that happened this long ago, he leaves 20 years later when he's 38, because Plato dies and leaves the academy to another student. So by the way, in case you guys, I don't know if you guys have heard about Plato's Academy before, but it was a very interesting institution. We don't know enough about it, but we do know it was higher learning. So the idea is like adults would come and study at this, much like at college. And it lasted 300 years, and it's pretty unique. There's not another institution quite like it in the West until, well, I mean, it's hard to say, but I'd say, you know, it might even be fair to say until Oxford in like 900. So that's another accomplishment on the part of the ancient Greeks, is the first university. So after Aristotle, he's very upset. He doesn't get the control of the academy, so he decides to travel. He travels, he takes odd jobs. He eventually becomes the tutor for Alexander the Great, who you should know about from your Western history classes. He's the guy who basically conquers everything and then dies. To give a very, very short explanation of him, Aristotle then returns to Athens and establishes his own school, the Lyceum, in 335 BC. Around this time, he writes most of his works. And interesting thing about the Lyceum is it was called a peripatetic school, in the sense that it was a walking school. So Aristotle, instead of lecturing in a classroom, would take his students on walks, and then as he was walking, lecture to them. So if you guys want to know a useful English word, peripatetic means walking or liking to walk. And so then Aristotle dies in 322 BC at the age of 62. Okay. It's quite a bit to cover in not too much time. Is that clear? All right. Awesome. So let's talk about the historical background of Aristotle. Because as Russell mentions, he's sort of the last of the great Greek philosophers. And there's a good reason why he's the last. It's not that all of a sudden Greece gets way dumber after he dies. I mean, that wouldn't make a ton of sense, right? It's that Aristotle lives in a very unique time in history. And I think the two sort of events that I want to cover are the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War. So the aftermath, what happened after, and the empire of Alexander the Great, who, as you remember, Aristotle tutored. And by the way, in terms of Peloponnesian War, we have a picture here. Obviously, very, very, well, not entirely true to history. I think I may have gotten this from a children's book. But we have the Athenian triremes, which are these ships. And then we also have, I don't know which city-state they're from, but they're hoplites. And they have the shields and the spears. All right. So the Peloponnesian War. So we covered it a little bit in the last class. So the Peloponnesian War was Athens versus Sparta. Roughly speaking, really it was the Delian League, which is Athens and its allies, and then Sparta versus Sparta and its allies. But in terms of the dominant people, it was Athens versus Sparta, and it ends in about 400 BC, so about 20 years before Aristotle's birth. So as the very basic story goes, Athens had used its naval power to become the dominant power in Greece. And naval power is like ships. It's these things, right? So Athens had used its naval power to become the dominant city in Greece, and they turned what was supposed to be an alliance of Greek states into really just Athens being on top and them getting money from everyone else and building themselves these huge, magnificent like buildings, like this one here, like Parthenon, which we really appreciate today when we go and visit Greece. But at the time, the other Greek city-states were like, this doesn't seem much like a league if we're giving you all this money and you're using it to build these great buildings in your own state and not giving us anything. So Sparta rallies up the other city-states, and there's a couple battles, and Sparta ends up winning out against Greece. Athens' navy is destroyed. Sparta becomes the dominant power. And there's a big change in the sort of makeup of Greece at that point. Because Athens, remember, they're thinking the best things in life are philosophy, or math, architecture, sculpture, like arts. So that's what Athens is spending all its money to. And like Sparta, on the other hand, does not take any of that seriously. Their soldiers and their entire economy is built on getting more slaves. All the work in Sparta is done by slaves. So that's going to become the like dominant culture in Greece. So Athens is almost completely destroyed. Sparta actually prevents it. Originally, the plan was by the other city-states to enslave all the Athenians and send them off, but Sparta stops that. But still, the defeat of Athens leaves it impoverished. It has no money. It never again becomes as successful as it was. And so Aristotle is at like the very tail end of this, and he's Athens and Greece's last great philosopher. There are other philosophers after that, but in terms of like the brilliant ones, that Aristotle is the last, and this is also, historians mark the end of the golden age of Greece. All right, cool stuff. Does that make sense to everyone? All right, awesome. So the other piece of Greek history that we need to understand Aristotle and the time in which he lived was Alexander the Great, who this is the best picture we have of him. He's this guy, the one who is unfortunately mostly wiped out by scraped off paint. But this is Alexander the Great leading a charge. So why was he so great? Like, how do you get that as part of your name? Well, so Alexander was a Macedonian, tutored by Aristotle. His father Philip II of Macedon, and that's what a Macedonian is, right? Just someone from Macedon, had transformed Macedon from an unimportant city-state to the most powerful in Greece. And he did this through his very innovative battle tactics. So by the time, so pretty quickly after Sparta defeats Athens, Macedon starts threatening from the north, and they become not, they don't dominate Greece in the way that Athens did, but they become the most powerful in Greece. And some of these battle tactics are having to do with what are called synergies. It's another useful English word for you. Synergy, when you put two things together and you end up with something greater than the whole. So like 1 + 1 = 3. He puts together various troop types. So he puts foot soldiers and cavalry together and ends up with these really innovative armies that are very dominant on the field. So Alexander uses the army to first control most of Greece, and he absorbs Greek culture. And then instead of sort of dominating the rest of Greece, or instead of being content with just Greece, he goes outwards and he invades everybody. And that helps him control a huge territory, and it also spreads Greek culture pretty far and wide. So Alexander dies 323 BC. His empire is partitioned among his followers, so various people get various territories. But this initial thing where Greek influences spread far and wide means that a lot of Greek philosophy is going to become very popular all over the world, but especially in what we would call today the Middle East. So Aristotle becomes famous in part because of this big push by Alexander. So the two of these combined first make sure that Aristotle is the last great Greek philosopher, and the second makes sure that Greek philosophy doesn't, sort of disappear or isn't just limited to Greece. Alexander spreads it everywhere. All right. Good stuff. That is the historical background of Aristotle. So if you guys are okay, we're going to go on to Aristotle's philosophy. All right. Cool. And here's where I think it'll be very nice to have John to help me translate, because as you guys probably know already from the pre-reading, that Aristotle's philosophy is pretty difficult. It's a lot harder to understand than Socrates. All right. So the first issue that we have with Aristotle's philosophy is how to approach it. So you guys remember, it's like 8 huge books. And it's hard to even know how to, like what to start with, because it's not organized in a way that you would expect. Here I say, intimidating large his corpus is, and corpus, Latin for body, so the body of his work. So I'm going to mostly follow how Russell does it and go piece by piece. So Aristotle's metaphysics. So Aristotle spends a lot of time trying to understand the world through the meaning of words, but he's never really sure about the differences between linguistic issues and the real world. So he's never really sure about the difference between language and what's true outside. For instance, so let's say Aristotle is trying to understand a bed. So he'd say bed is a general term. So like this is a bed as a general term. Plato's bed is a specific term. In that case, you're no longer talking about a general bed. Now you're talking about a specific bed that exists, probably in Plato's house. So Aristotle is trying to infer truths about the world through distinctions like this. What makes it so there's a specific bed in Plato's house, which is an instance of the general term bed? What can we say about beds in general? So an essential term here is the word essence, which is the characteristic of a thing that makes it what it is. So the essence of a bed is what makes it the bed. And Aristotle spends a ton of time trying to explain what essence is, but never really considers that that's how we just how we describe things, just in terms of how we recognize what a bed is, instead of something like natural or physical. So the last sort of term we have to understand here with our bed example is form versus matter. So matter, what a bed is made up of. So for this one, it looks like wood and leather. And form is how we conceive of it. So Aristotle, in trying to explain forms, which he, as we'll learn, he takes from Plato, says that bed, in this specific, like Plato's bed, is matter of wood and leather that takes on the form of bed in the general. It's a little confusing, but Aristotle spends a ton of time explaining the world through this, how matter is taking on a certain form. So the other sort of part of Aristotle's metaphysics is causes. So causes is basically a way of asking, 4 ways of asking why something exists. So there's material, formal, efficient, and final. So that's the 4 ways of answering why something exists. So material is what makes something up. Formal is what form it takes. So remember, bed takes on the form of bed. Efficient is what causes something. And final is the ultimate goal. So this helps Aristotle categorize the world, and as he believes, understand it. And here's the diagram. Efficient cause, if we're talking about a sculpture. The efficient cause, he causes the sculpture to come into being. The formal cause, this is the form that the sculpture will take once he's carved it. The final cause, the ultimate goal, is to be displayed in a museum. And the material cause is the marble, which is what makes the sculpture up. And Aristotle, when he's talking about final causes, can get quite religious, because eventually when you talk about final cause, final cause, final cause, you're thinking, what's the ultimate goal of everything? And Aristotle says, generally speaking, things are, the final cause of everything is God. Thomas Aquinas, a Catholic philosopher who we'll talk about in a couple lessons, takes this and runs with it. So he is very impressed by this, and he spends a lot of time thinking about this. All right, so now I'm going to hand it over to John to do a brief translation of Aristotle's metaphysics.
好，那个刚才出现了几个很重要的概念哈，然后第一个当然是本质，就是一个物质的本质，我们在说它的时候，比如说一个船舶，可以有各种各样的船舶，但是各种各样的船舶之间也不尽相同，但是它们都有比如一样的功能，让船舶成为船舶之水，以是船舶，然后这是一个重要的概念。然后刚才 Trevor 谈到了就是形式和物质的对立，就是我们可以理解，比如说一个船舶，它 它的物质上，对不起，它的船铺有一个船铺，然后这个船铺呢，它有这个船铺的形式，基本上所有的船铺都有4个角，还有一个平面，然后但是呢，船铺却是由不同的物质组成的，然后在这个形式，比如说有些船铺是木头做的，有些船铺是竹子做的，它可以是不同的，所以在一个东西的物质和一个东西的形式，这是亚里士多德做的很重要的一个区分。然后刚才 Trevor 也谈到了4种物质的原因，那分别是质料因、形式因、动力因和目的因。刚才 Trevor 拿的一个例子就是雕刻的大理石塑像，那它的形式因当然就是这个雕塑的形象，它的物质因就是雕塑的石头，然后它的动力因当然是这个雕塑的人，这样子凿出了这个雕塑，还有它的目的因就是它最后是为了放在一个地方展出来取悦民众，所以这是亚里士多德对于物质的原因做的一个重要的区分。
Okay. All right. Cool stuff. Does that make sense? Everyone understand Aristotle's metaphysics?
对不起，我刚才坐得太远了，sitting too far from it. So where's
the little hard to tell.
Okay, I will speak louder later. 对不起，
Alright.
对不起。
For next one, we'll speak louder. All right.
Okay.
Cool stuff. So Aristotle's theology. So theology is beliefs about God, religion, that sort of stuff. We're not going to go really into it, even though Aristotle does, because for all of our purposes, when we're talking about Western philosophy, the form it takes with Thomas Aquinas is the most important one, because that's what the Catholics follow, and that's what the West will end up following. So just very quickly, though, Aristotle does believe in God and a soul, but his conceptions of it, his ideas of what God and soul are quite complex and quite surprising for for us who are similar with or familiar with the Christian idea of a soul. So, for instance, the soul and the body are separate. The soul unifies the body, so it takes like 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, and makes it one. And then part of the soul is the mind, which thinks. So the soul basically gives the body form in some sense, and then the soul, part of the soul is the mind, which thinks. So the thinking part of the soul is immortal, but the rest of the soul is not immortal. And immortal means can't die, so normally we think of the soul can't die, the soul is immortal. So Aristotle believes rational thinking is divine, irrational thinking is mortal. So thinking like logically, like a mathematician, is a divine way of thinking. It's thinking like God. And then thinking not like a mathematician is like a man. So every man thinks in the same way rationally, so logically, but not every man thinks in the same way irrationally, so illogically. So one way of interpreting this is that the mind is immortal because all men think of rationally in the same way. So it's not literally immortal, it's just everyone's going to keep thinking like this until the dawn of time. Or maybe it doesn't, because Aristotle never really clarifies. So that's one of the very frustrating things about Aristotle, is he'll write a ton, but he never, not always, but sometimes he just doesn't answer the question that you want him to answer. All right. Yeah, John, do you want to summarize that quickly?
Yeah, Trevor 刚才用到了一个很重要的一个概念，就是之前我们提到的亚里士多德对于质料和形式的区分，然后在灵魂和肉体上，亚里士多德也把这个质料和形式的对立应用到了这个图式里，就是对他来说，身体很大程度上是人的质料，而灵魂很大程度上是人的形式，然后这是刚才Trevor 做的很重要的一个 argue。
All right, cool stuff. And I think that's pretty clear, pretty simple. So we're going to go on to Aristotle's ethics. So ethics, you know, how you should behave, how you should live, what a lot of this course is going to be covering, approximately a quarter of this course. So for Aristotle, ethics are very intellectual. That's why we're discussing them here, because Aristotle takes a very logical approach to ethics. So he believes in moderation for everything, like they preach in Buddhism. You know, the forget what it's called, like the Eightfold Path or whatever. So Aristotle takes his moderation too far. So he believes in moderation for everything. So, you know, if you think of, yeah, you should be moderate when in terms of how much you should speak. So you shouldn't talk too much and you shouldn't talk too little. And you say, okay, that makes sense. You shouldn't be too prideful. Like you should be proud of what you do, but not arrogant. And you say, okay, that makes sense. But Aristotle says, no, we need to think about that, everything that way. So, you know, when you're speaking of like truthfulness, like you should be not too truthful, not lying all the time, but somewhere in the middle. You shouldn't give too much to charity or too little, but somewhere in the middle. And it gets sort of ridiculous, especially when you're thinking of like, you know, think of a judge in a court who's like, oh yeah, I'm a very ethical guy. You know, I take bribes only half the time. It's like that's not really a proper way to think about ethics, at least in the normal sense. So other parts of Aristotle's ethics are he loves categorizing the world. So he also categorizes men. And part of like this idea of categorizing men is that the best man, which Aristotle, you know, presumably is, just gets everything. Like the best man deserves the best of everything. So he just takes it. And then the ethics come in when he like takes it, but he's like pretty nice about it. He says, yes, I deserve, you know, the best house and the best food and the best horse. But like, you know, don't feel too bad about it. And then he treats everyone else according to how good they are. So like the best man, other best men he treats as his equals, and then like slaves he treats poorly. So, and then finally, the last part of Aristotle's ethics that we'll cover is his idea that everything in the end is good if it trends towards happiness as the final goal. So remember, final cause is what things are supposed to end up as. For Aristotle, ethics is based around happiness, which we might call fulfillment. All right. I think that's pretty simple, and I want to get into logic. Does everyone understand? All right, great. I don't know what lo sé means, but that might be Spanish, which I do not speak. But everyone else says I, so let's go on. So, in terms of the purpose of this portion of the course, is the most important part for us is logic. So the key concept we're trying to understand here with Aristotle's logic is the syllogism. Major premise, minor premise, conclusion, which is deductive reasoning. And deductive reasoning is logical reasoning in which you start off with premises like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And that's deductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning, which we'll cover later, is reasoning from patterns. So just to be clear on sort of terminology, John, can you translate for me just premise, major premise, minor premise, conclusion?
这是一个很重要的亚里士多德的一个逻辑学的概念，就是它的三段论。在三段论中，我们有这三个因素，或者三个部件，分别是大前提、小前提和结论。
All right, great. So these are going to be very important concepts for us moving forward, because this is probably Aristotle's greatest impact on the world is his logic. So Aristotle categorizes everything, and logic is one of the things he categorizes. He divides up his syllogisms, you know, which are basically this very basic form of deductive reasoning. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So he divides it up into four categories, and there are various versions of affirmative definitions, negative definitions. And they have all these technical names, but really, like, the issue here is just all S are, for instance, all S are P, all men are mortal, no men are mortal, some men are not mortal, some men are mortal, right? So I'm not going to go into the technical names. I don't really care that much, although you should know that these are called contradictories, contraries, and what that just means is if all men are mortal, there's no way that no men are mortal. That is literally the opposite of that. And there's also, maybe somewhat less obvious, if all men are mortal, there's no way that some men are not mortal. And same thing here, contrary, subcontrary. All right. Let's go into our very first idea of syllogisms. And this is the main one that we're going to cover. So there's this idea of, it's called Barbara, which is all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Or alternatively, all men are mortal, all Greeks are men, therefore Greeks are mortal. And so Aristotle believes that all deductive reasoning can be stated in this fashion. But what are the problems with it? Well, in a second, I'm going to defer to Russell. I'm going to let Lord Bertrand Russell talk about this because he's far more qualified than I am, considering he was one of the great logicians of the 20th century. But before that, I'll have John briefly translate this because, again, this is like very important and we need to make sure that we are all on the same page as we go into Aristotle's logic.
刚才 Trevor 就谈到了四种deduction 就是四种推断的模型，分别是肯定、否定、部分肯定和部分否定这样子一个情况。我想这两个三段论的例子，我不知道大家都看懂了吗？就是应该从语义上就很容易达到的结果。
All right, does that make sense? Yeah, good. All right. Cool stuff. So we now understand Aristotle's idea of logic. So let's talk about what Russell finds wrong with it. So what Russell is bothered by with Aristotle's logic is that all men are mortal is a much harder statement to make than Socrates is a man. So remember, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man. So in order to conclude that Socrates is a man, we'd be happy with just minor evidence. For instance, last class when we were talking about Socrates, I told you that Socrates was a man. You didn't have much problem believing that. You were like, okay, sure, there's a book written about him. He's a man. You know, you think maybe he might have been a woman. Almost certainly wasn't like a goat or a horse. So you were okay with that. On the other hand, in order to conclude that all men are mortal, we need a ton of evidence. So really, you would want the idea that no man can die, or that all men die eventually, is a very difficult claim to make. Because like really, like on the one hand, you sort of want to look through every man on Earth and figure out, will he die eventually? On the other hand, the other thing that you would want to do is maybe find some scientific reason for that. But still, this is something that's been debated. So the problem is when we just put this as major premise, minor premise, we don't really address the fact that A is so much more difficult of a statement to make. We need so much more evidence for it than we do for B. And we just act like they're not that different from each other, when in fact they are. So that's first problem. Second problem, so Socrates is a name referring to a specific man, right? So the first case is pretty easy. We've got general rule, specific example. General rule applies to specific example. General rule, all men are mortal. Specific example, Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. However, the second example here, all men are mortal, all Greeks are men, therefore Greeks are mortal, does something different here. Because Greeks are a nationality, right? They're not a type of man. It's not like red-headed men or tall men or whatever. It's a nationality. It's something artificial. So instead of implying truths about the real world through our logic, we force all Greeks to be part of one category, all Greeks to be men. We force that in our definition. And then we just restate the definition. So this might not be, one way to think about it is like, what if we said, you know, some Greeks are horses or whatever. That would make the definition more like make the this conclusion not so valid. Or on the other hand, just to make really like something really obviously ridiculous, we could say, for instance, all men are mortal, all pancakes are men, therefore pancakes are mortal. And you know, pancakes, breakfast food. If to make it more maybe applicable to your diet, all men are mortal, all rice is men, therefore rice is mortal. Or all men are mortal, all unicorns are men, therefore unicorns are mortal. So it's still logically correct. There's nothing wrong with my logic there, but it doesn't really apply to the real world. It seems ridiculous. So we're either making something up or we're misapplying a word, but we're not doing the same thing that we were here. We're not saying a specific example of a man, we're creating a definition. Okay. That makes sense to everyone. And so just to be totally sure, so it's not that it's necessarily sure that all Greeks are men is wrong. It's just, it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily true. It could be true, but really the issue here is we're creating a definition with Greeks. That's not something that's like a category of people. Meanwhile, Socrates was just a specific man. Did I say the second example was not so sure because it made the definition worse? No, the second example isn't sure, not because it makes the definition worse, but because it creates this category of Greeks. Creates a category, says everyone in this category is a man. And then it just restates it. Everyone in this category is a man, therefore everyone in this category is mortal. So I could create a different category here. I could say all, dogs are men. And that doesn't apply to what we think of the real world, but, I say all dogs are men. And I've created this category called dogs in which everyone in the category is a man. And then I can just say, because everyone in the category is a man, everyone in the category is mortal. So yeah, to some extent, Greek is a new conception here. To some extent, yeah. All right. So people in the back of the class, does this make sense? Is anyone who doesn't normally speak up, are you lost? Okay. That means everyone is following along, even the people who aren't speaking up. All right. All right. So let's go on then, and see if we can make it to the end of, well, let's see if we can make it to background of Aristotle's philosophy before the break at 10 o'clock. All right. So we covered Russell's problem with Barbara, right? And his problems with Barbara are what we talked about. All men are mortal versus Socrates is a man, and Socrates is a man versus all Greeks are men. Now we have problems with syllogisms and deduction in general. So one problem is it's just ridiculous to say this is the only way to form a logical deduction. So if we tried to prove the Pythagorean theorem with syllogisms, and which would be natural because it is mathematics and mathematics is mostly deductive, it'd be ridiculously hard, and it'd also be very pointless. It makes way more sense to just admit other forms of deduction. For example, this geometric proof here, which is I think, very, very clear. It's not in the same form as, major premise, minor premise, conclusion, but you see, you make the triangles and you form them together and you get a squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's a very clear, clear proof. And then the other problem with deduction as a whole is that deduction is barren. And by barren, I mean you don't get more out of it than you started with. So you start with the idea that all men are mortal, and then you can get from it that Socrates is mortal. But in order to get to that first premise, in order to know all men are mortal, we need to reason from a pattern of men being mortal. And the only way to reason from a pattern is a form of reasoning called induction. So if we get enough evidence of men dying, every man that we interview dies, we learn something new. All men probably die. And then we can start with our deduction. All men are mortal. All right. Cool. John, do you want to quickly sum this up?
OK， 我们刚才谈到了亚里士多德说到的人最重要的推理形式就是这样的三段论。我们有 A 有 B， 然后 A 加 B 推出了 C。但是我们看到，其实很多时候我们的思考并没有完全按照这样的 A、B、C 的三段论的推导顺序来进行。比如说，在毕达哥拉斯推断他的勾股定理的时候，是不是所有同学都看得见或者看得懂这个例子的意思呢？就是 should I would take a more explanation of that.
Okay.
Deduction here. So, 大家看这两个正方形哈，就是其实这两个正方形，大的正方形是一样大的，但是呢，如果我们把边长分成 A 和 B 的部分，那大家看，其实左边正方形挖掉的4个三角形的面积和右边的正方形挖掉的三角形的面积，比如说这个三角形和这个三角形是一样的。那这两个同样大的大正方形扣掉了这4个小的三角形之后呢，剩下的部分的面积在左边是中央的那个白色的正方形，在右边是2个白色的正方形，它们2个正方形的面积应该是一样的，因为扣掉的三角形面积是一样的。那由此可知 C 的平方，也就是左边正中间的大四边形的面积和右边2个四边形的面积应该是一样的，所以 C 的平方等于 A 的平方加上 B 的平方，这个形式上就正好是勾股定理，也就是毕达哥拉斯定理的形状。但是我们在这个推导中完全没有想到哪个东西是大前提，哪个东西是小前提，哪个的结论当然是勾股定理。所以有时候呢，我们会觉得是不是三段论这样子的一个推导过程太有局限了，在很多数学推导或者在很多思考的时候，我们平时其实并没有严格的按照三段论的方法来进行。清楚了吗？如果不清楚的话，要说不清楚。
All right, good stuff. So that's Aristotle's logic very quickly. And then the last thing we're going to be covering here in terms of Aristotle's philosophy, before we go on a quick break, is Aristotle's physics. So Aristotle's physics, just the general term for his science, is the science of a very intelligent man who thinks that the world has to make sense to him personally. Like there's nothing in the world that could possibly not make sense to Aristotle. So it's very interesting to see what a very intelligent man thinks about the world. It's historically important because it's the dominant scientific theory in the Western world until Galileo, and it's also nonsense. It's not helpful at all to our modern understanding of science, so we can pretty much safely ignore it. So let's go over the theory quickly. So the main points of the theory: everything has a purpose. and everything is either in potentiality or actuality. So everything is potentially moving or actually moving. And moving here is complicated, and it includes like changing. So like ice melting is a movement. You know, ice is potentially melting, and it's also, or on the other hand, if it's hot out, it's actually melting. In terms of the makeup of everything, everything is made up of earth, air, fire, water, and the heavens, and it all has a natural movement. So fire goes upwards, things on earth have a naturally rectilinear movement, so they move like that, straight lines. And so like all of these ideas that everything has a purpose, that the reason why a rock falls to earth is because it's meant to be on earth, this is just harmful to science. So Galileo, we all know, he shocks his colleagues with the idea that Earth isn't the center of the universe, but he also shocks his colleagues with the idea that cannonballs go in parabolas, right? They're very surprised by that. And it's also possible to talk in general about how harmful the idea that the science of the world has to make sense to us personally has been to our understanding, and how a lot of science's progress has been accepting that it doesn't necessarily make sense to our personal logic. But Aristotle is like a very, very clear example of this logical fallacy. All right, so that's Aristotle's physics. It's important, it's interesting, but it's sort of stupid. Before we go on to background of Aristotle's philosophy, we're going to take a quick break. So I'll see you back here in, let's say, 5 minutes. So 10:08, you can grab some water, drink a little bit, eat some food, come back refreshed and ready to go over the background to Aristotle's philosophy. Sound good? All right, good stuff. While people are grabbing water, eating food, whatever, um, John, do you need to
Water.
get some water? All right. So I'm happy to take any questions. I appreciate the roses. Class isn't done yet, but I do appreciate the roses. Meaning of Barbara. So I'm gonna guess here based on my knowledge of Greek philosophy, but I may be wrong in this, or based on my knowledge of Greek, but I may be wrong. So my guess is that it has to do with the Greeks' idea of barbarians in the north, and like the idea is that that was like sort of the Greek approximation of what barbarian speech sounded like, as bar bar bar. That would be my guess, but I'm not positive what the meaning of Barbara is. Unfortunately, I only took 6 months of Greek, so that was back in high school. All right. What's the cable? All right. Cool. Any other questions? What do people think of Aristotle so far? Better than Socrates or worse than Socrates? In terms of how much you like his philosophy. No opinion? No one has any strong feelings about Aristotle? Oh, okay. Better in science, not in asking questions. Yeah. Proves a lot. Okay. Oh, what is the difference between the internal world and the real world? So in terms of the way I use it, the way I use the terms, internal world is what you're thinking, your perception of things. The real world is how things actually are. So for instance, if you're dreaming and you're thinking that you're on a boat, then your internal world is so different from the real world. Or same thing if you're very sick and you start seeing things that aren't there. And then most of the time we think that our idea of the real world is pretty similar to our internal world. So I think that when I see a laptop in front of me, in the real world there really is a laptop in front of me. So that's what I mean by when I use those terms. If you're asking in a philosophical sense, that is an excellent question, and there will be a lot of time to think about that and argue about that, because many philosophers try to take on that question. Yeah. All right, good question. And yes, Aristotle is tricky to understand, which is why I'm very lucky that I have such smart and hardworking students. I don't think I could do this with a class that wasn't quite so smart as you guys. All right, it's 10:09. So let's resume with background to Aristotle's philosophy. Everyone can see the PowerPoint? All right. Great. So two main contributors to all right. Sorry, the additional questions about people in the four causes and about knowing the real world accurately, I'll try to cover at the end of the lesson if we have time. Sorry about that. All right. So background to Aristotle's philosophy. So the two main contributors that we have to think about are Aristotle's teacher, Plato, and his teacher's teacher, Socrates. So first things first, let's cover who we know, which is Socrates. Here's a nice statue of Socrates, deep in thought. So as we know, he believes in deductions and definitions, categories to come up with truth. And Socrates uses his system of questioning to draw out internal contradictions and thinking and resolve them. So although using this system of questioning will not necessarily result in something that relates to the real world, if you do it properly, if you make sure there's no contradictions and you make sure all your definitions don't contradict each other, you'll end up with a complete system of philosophy. And so Aristotle does this enough he pursues this process enough that he comes up with really a system of thinking for everything. As I mentioned, like pretty much everything that you can think of, Aristotle has covered. And so one effect of that is that it's completely possible to only exist in a system of Aristotelian thought. So you can think about everything like Aristotle, and in fact, many thinkers in the West did. And as we'll see, for instance, in the Middle Ages, both in the Arab world and in the European world, there are a lot of smart people who only thought about things like Aristotle would have thought about them. And they could do that because the Aristotelian thought is mostly free of contradictions and it's very extensive. It covers everything. So that's where what Aristotle gets from Socrates. So Plato. So we've covered Plato so far only as a recorder of what Socrates said, although as we mentioned, it can be very hard to tell where Socrates ends and Plato begins, because Plato definitely doesn't record what Socrates says exactly how he says it. And he also has a very weird habit of frequently, when he writes like dialogues to explain his philosophy, he uses Socrates as a character in his dialogues. So it gets very difficult to tell, like, is this supposed to be Plato talking, or like through Socrates, or is it supposed to be Socrates talking, or is it a combination of them? It gets very confusing. But beyond just like what he recorded or what he supposedly recorded, Plato was also a very influential thinker. And so many philosophers, philosophy courses actually cover him in great detail when talking about how to think. I don't have a whole lesson devoted to Plato's logic because I don't think it fits into like a very practical view of philosophy, which is how I take it. On the other hand, Plato's ideas of how to govern and how to form a city do fit into that idea of philosophy. So we'll cover him then as the first person to talk about with how things should work. So Plato's essential doctrine is what we see and feel is imperfect and corporeal. So imperfect, obviously not perfect. Corporeal, it has a body. You can touch it. So meanwhile, the world of knowledge is perfect, beautiful, and beautiful is a very tricky word. So I would just say accept it as it is now, but watch out for it. And that's where our world gets its forms from. And we covered what forms are. And that's incorporeal, right? You can't touch it. So Plato means this as both a logical point and a metaphysical point. So logically, he's thinking the same way as Aristotle is. We see a cat and we say that's a cat because we have an idea of what the term cat means. But Plato also means something quite strange, which is that there are perfect forms which exist, like maybe in heaven or something like that, which lend themselves to the imperfect examples we see on earth. So there's this sense of like what we see on earth is borrowing its imperfect like body from this perfect world of knowledge. And so Plato thinks of that in terms of geometry, and it makes sense. Like he says, you know, when you draw a circle on a chalkboard, then what you're drawing isn't going to be a perfect circle, but you do have this perfect idea in your head. And that's, according to Plato, that's because there's a perfect like circle in heaven or knowledge or something. Unfortunately, it does get very complicated when we talk about a cat. You know, what is a perfect cat? I mean, I've had cats, which are very nice cats, but I can't really think of one that would be a perfect cat. All right. This is a little complicated, so John, can you quickly translate for me?
Yes, yeah, Trevor 谈到了就是柏拉图和亚里士多德在形而上学里的一个很重要的区别，那就是呢，我们刚才说在亚里士多德的世界，它有区分质料和形式，但是它不像柏拉图那样子区分出一个所谓的不可见的完美的世界和我们现在物质的世界之间的区分，区别在哪里呢？在我们的物质世界中，比如说我们会有很多不同样子的猫，但是这些猫呢，它们可能想共享着某些很共有的特征，而这些特征呢，可能在另外一个完全理想的世界中形成的一只完美的猫，然后那个世界是这个世界的原型，而这个世界每一个具体的实体呢，都是那个世界某种意义上是一种不完美的复制或者不完美的投影，这是亚里士多德和柏拉图在形而上学观或者说世界观上的一个很大的区别，对。
All right. So Aristotle, in the simplest terms, is the logic of Socrates and the idealism of Plato. So like this idea of like perfection applied to the real world. He tries to, this is going to be a hard sentence. He's trying to understand things by understanding our understanding of them. So he's trying to think about things by thinking about how we think about them. And then he's trying to use logic to clarify all this. And the range to which he applies his thoughts is far greater than Socrates or Plato. And to that extent, Aristotle is unique. Plato, you can't think of this whole world in this in just Platonic philosophy in the same way that you can Aristotelian philosophy. Aristotle is really astonishing with just how much he writes about. By the way, these are the Platonic solids here. Thought it was just nice illustration. You guys may have covered them in math class. If not, well, we won't cover them now, but perhaps we'll find time to cover them later. All right. So we've covered all the basics of Aristotle's philosophy. So now we're going to go on to Aristotle's writings. So Aristotle is described by ancient writers as a wonderful author, just like Plato and maybe better. There's a quote from some famous ancient writer, which is that like if Plato has a silver tongue, Aristotle has a golden tongue. The funny thing is, all the surviving writings that we have of Aristotle are really difficult to understand. And that's not just like me talking, it's everyone thinks that. They're really difficult to understand. And that's probably because what we have now is lecture notes. So, you know, like the notes he would take before talking to his students. And they were never meant to be published like they are. So I'll go over them with you, but don't be surprised if you find them confusing. And when you do the reading after class, as you should, don't be surprised if you find them very confusing and sort of disorganized. It's really, he's one of the like worst writers that we'll read in this course. So the specific topic that we're going to talk about today is Zeno's paradoxes, which are really fun to talk about. And it's fun to see Aristotle's take on them, even if it's very hard to understand what his take actually is. All right. So Zeno's first paradox that Aristotle discusses is, imagine you're walking 10 meters. Before you walk 10 meters, you need to walk 5 meters. Before you walk 5 meters, you need to walk 2.5 meters. Before you walk 2.5 meters, you need to walk 1.25 meters. And the problem is, essentially, you'll find you have to complete an infinite series of tasks in a finite period of time. And there's a question of how you even start walking in the first place. If you keep on dividing it further and further and further, and you never get to the point where you start walking. This picture here, I couldn't find a good example of this. This is the opposite. This is how it reaches to here, but you can see how it applies the same way, right? It goes half, and then it goes, before it can do the second half, it has to go half that. Before it can do the second half of that, it has to do half that, so on and so forth. So you keep doing half, 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 and it seems like the arrow will never reach the woman. So this is Zeno's paradox, infinite series of tasks, in this case, walking 10 meters, walking 5 meters, 2.5, 1.25, in a finite period of time. For the record, Diogenes the Cynic, who is possibly he is one of the greatest guys to read about in Greek philosophy because he's hilarious. When Diogenes the Cynic heard this, he stood up and he walked 10 meters. So that's like the really easy answer to this is it doesn't matter what the paradox is, everyone can walk 10 meters. But let's look at Aristotle's logical answer to this. So first I'm going to read it just straight out, and then I'm going to explain what it means. So reading it, and be prepared, it's not very good. It's not very good English. Hence, Zeno's argument makes a false assumption in asserting that it is impossible for a thing to pass over or severally to come into contact with infinite things in a finite time. For there are two senses in which length and time, and generally anything continuous, are called infinite. They are called so either in respect of divisibility or in respect of their extremities. So while a thing in a finite time cannot come in contact with things quantitatively infinite, it can come into contact with things infinite in respect of divisibility. For in this sense, the time itself is also infinite, so we find that the time occupied by the passage over the infinite is not an finite, but an infinite time. And the contact with the infinities is made by means of moments not finite, but infinite in number. So that was probably very unclear, so let me translate that. So Aristotle says basically infinity can mean two things. It can mean either a line stretches out infinitely, or that a line is divisible infinitely. The paradox, the reason why it's confusing is we're getting confused over the difference between stretching out infinitely and being divisible infinitely. So once we realize that it's not a finite time over an infinite distance, but really an infinitely divisible amount of time, because time can be divisible in the same way, before 10 seconds, 5 seconds, before 5 seconds, 2.5 seconds, so on and so forth. It becomes much easier to understand. We're not talking about finite time, infinite distance. We're either talking about finite time, finite distance, or infinitely divisible time, infinitely divisible distance. All right, cool stuff. John, do you want to translate?
Yeah. Yes. Trevor 刚才就说了第一个芝诺悖论以及亚里士多德对他的反驳。然后我想悖论大家看得很清楚了，就是芝诺声称，因为我们走完10米的这一个事件可以分成无穷个事件，事件1是我们走了5米，事件2是我们走了2.5米，事件3是我们走了1.25米，如此下去以至于无穷。这样我们有无限件事情去做，我们怎么可能在有限的事情里完成的呢？那亚里士多德的反驳，然后Trevor 也在他的归纳里面写到了，大概是这样的，就是呢，芝诺说我们不可能在有限的时间，芝诺说我们应该用无限的时间来做完无限的事情，但是呢，芝诺的这个宣称中，这两个无限是不一样的，因为无限的时间指的是无限长的时间，而无限的事件指的是无限可分的无限，就是前者呢是指一个时间它被 拉向无穷远的地方或者无穷长的地方。而在第二个无限中，就所谓的无限个事件，并不是一个无穷大的无限的概念，而是我们把一个有限的事情不断的细分这样子的过程，或者这样子的一个行为所产生的无限。这两种无限是非常的不一样的。所以呢，我们不能把两个无限放在同一个主句中说，就是说，有限的时间只能做完有限的事情，这两个有限，或者只有用无限的时间才能做完无限的事情，这两种无限是非常不一样的无限。大家能想象吗？就是因为无限的时间是量上的无限，而无限的事件是一种次数上的无限，它们性质是完全不同的。我不知道这种 argument 大家听懂了没有？哦
All right.
好厉害。
Good. So let's talk about you got a bravo.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you.
Yeah.
It's for you.
Yeah. So let's continue on with this. So he also addresses how you start walking in the first place. So the question before was how you walk 10 meters. Now the question is how you start walking in the first place. And so as before, I'm going to read what Aristotle wrote, and then I'll put it in simple English, and then John can translate it. All right. So what Aristotle wrote, the present is also is necessarily indivisible. The present, that is, not in the sense in which the word is applied to one thing in virtue of another, but in its proper and primary sense, in which sense it is inherent in all time. For the present is something that is an extremity of the past, no part of the future being on this side of it, and also of the future, no part of the past being on the other side of it. It is, as we have said, a limit of both. And if it is once shown that it is essentially of this character and one and the same, it will at once be evident also that it is indivisible. All right, so what does that mean? So Aristotle argues that you're not going to be in motion at the present precisely because it's indivisible. So it doesn't occupy time. The present isn't some slice of time. It's not part of time. Therefore, it will take some finite amount of time to cover the 10 meters or the rest of that 10 meters. But it doesn't make sense to worry about how you're going to walk right now. So we're not in time, so let's not worry about how we're going to walk right now if we're saying right now is the present. And here we get the sense that it's like 0 isn't negative, it's not positive, it's right in the middle. And so it doesn't make sense to say, how will we ever start with the positive numbers if we're starting at 0? Or how would we ever get into the negative numbers if we're starting at 0? Because 0 is neither, and that's the point of 0. It's an extremity of the positive, it's an extremity of the negative. All right. Cool stuff. John, would you like to translate?
其实这个争论我也没有看得太明白，但是我想大概的意思是说，比如说就是说现在这个时刻它是一个不占有任何时间长度的时刻，就像零一样。我们知道任何一个复数，它的邻域之间的数，只要这个邻域数足够小，那它也一定是复数，而正数的邻域之间的数字也应该包含的所有正数，但是零不具备这两个性质，所以呢，零它既不是正数，也不是负数，它似乎没有变成正数和负数的任何的可能性。那如果我们在走动的过程中，我们势必要经过零点，然后从负迈向正，或者从正迈向负。可是我在零点的时候，既然没有太大的变化的可能性，那我这个连续的运动又怎么是可能的呢？然后据说这是亚里士多德对于芝诺的悖论的反驳，然后这是我所理解的。
And everyone good? Make sense?
So it's my question. It's a contra-argument of Aristotle against Zeno's paradox.
Yeah, so essentially, Aristotle says Zeno's paradox is of two forms. The first is, how do you walk 10 meters, considering that 10 meters is infinitely divisible?
Yeah.
The second part of Zeno's paradox is how you start walking at all, considering before you start walking, you have to walk, some infinitely divisible thing. So his two answers are, first, infinitely divisible time and infinitely divisible space. And second of all, the question of how you start walking, considering you're like at a moment frozen in time, is that you're not frozen in time. You're just, when you think of the present, when you think of starting walking, like you're not in time in the first place. So I think this might be more clear when we talk a little, when we go into our next paradoxes. If it's not clear then, we'll come back and we'll go back to this.
Yeah.
All right. So, second paradox. So for the second paradox, what question is that? All right. We'll cover a teaching assistant is majoring in math.
Yeah. 以前有学过数学。
Yeah.
Yeah, I did mathematics somewhere in the remote past.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, he's a bit shy, but he got a bachelor's in mathematics from
Peking University. So
yeah. So all right, let's do second paradox. So yeah, this one is more clearly explained. So within Aristotle. So Chinese are all good at math. I don't know about that. But okay. So second Zeno's paradox. First, I'll read it, then explain it, then hand it over. So the second is the so-called Achilles, and it amounts to this: that in a race, the quickest runner can never overtake the slowest, since the pursuer must first reach the point whence the pursued started, so that the slower must always hold the lead. This argument is the same in principle as that which depends on bisection, though it differs from that the spaces with which we successfully have to deal are not divided into halves. The result of this argument is that the slower is not overtaken, but it proceeds along the same lines as the bisection argument, for in both the division of the space in a certain way leads to the result that the goal is not reached, though the Achilles goal goes further in that it affirms that even the quickest runner in legendary tradition must fail in his pursuit of the slowest, so that the solution must be the same. And the axiom that which holds a lead is never overtaken is false. It is not overtaken, it is true while it holds a lead, but it is overtaken nevertheless if it is granted that it traverses the finite distance prescribed. So the way the argument works, my explanation, I have a picture here. So we have Achilles, who's this legendary Greek warrior, and we have a tortoise. And I think you guys all know what a tortoise is. Turtle, tortoise, they're very slow creatures. Although if you get them angry, they can actually move pretty fast. But that's not important for our lesson today. So the idea is Achilles, this Greek warrior, and the tortoise are having a race. And the tortoise says, okay, I want a 10-meter head start because you're faster than me. And Achilles says, oh yeah, sure. Like, that makes sense. And he thinks it's still a turtle, like, I'm going to be able to run fast it anyways. So in the first, let's say, 5 seconds, Achilles goes this distance. So he travels from here to here, and he reaches where the turtle starts from. And the turtle goes, let's say, 2 meters. So he goes slightly further. In the next 3 seconds, Achilles once again reaches the point that the turtle starts from, and the turtle goes a bit further. Achilles once again reaches the point that the turtle starts from, and the turtle goes a bit further. And it seems that because every time Achilles is trying to reach every time Achilles reaches the point that the turtle starts from, the turtle has gone a little bit further. So it seems like Achilles can never actually beat the tortoise in a race. He'll never actually go past him. So Aristotle's answer to this is that this is okay for Achilles to reach the infinite series of where the turtle has been, or the tortoise has been, and will be in a finite series of time, because time, like distance, is infinitely divisible. So once again, we're relying on our confusion of infinity. There's an infinite series of where the turtle has been, but that doesn't mean an infinitely long series. It's not an infinite distance. It's an infinitely divisible distance. And so again, it's okay for Achilles to traverse this infinitely divisible distance in a finite series of time. So it's okay for it to take 10 seconds for Achilles to go from the start to the end, even though there's an infinite number of points in the middle that Achilles has to cross. So that's Aristotle's answer to Zeno's second paradox, that of Achilles and the turtle. So I'll hand it over to John now for translation.
好啊，所以又是一个芝诺的悖论，这是他的第二个悖论。就像第一个悖论一样，这个整个阿基里斯这个古希腊的英雄，追上一只乌龟的事件，是为什么要阿基里斯追乌龟？它被细分成了很多事件。第一个事件呢，我们想想，乌龟停在了 B 点，阿基里斯从 A 点开始追，但他追上乌龟的时候，乌龟已经又跑了一段距离，那阿基里斯现在要完成第二个事件，就是他要 cover， 他要追上乌龟刚才在他追逐的过程中又跑过的这段路，然后追上乌龟的时候呢，乌龟又会再走一段距离，这样子又是一个事件被细分成无穷个的一个追逐的过程。那同样，芝诺说，在有限的时间里不可能完成无限的事件。然后呢，亚里士多德的反驳当然就类似于对第一个悖论的反驳，是指责芝诺混淆了两种无限的概念。
All right. Everyone understand? All right. Good stuff. So that's two of Zeno's paradoxes down. So let's look at Zeno's third paradox. So Zeno's third paradox is that, again, Aristotle does a terrible job at explaining this one. So I've explained it. A flying arrow, if you look at it in any given moment of time, an arrow is going to be at rest. So if you take a picture of an arrow, then you take a picture here, arrow's frozen. You take a picture here, arrow's frozen. Take a picture here, arrow's frozen. If you take a movie, the movie is going to show the arrow just going straight to the target. If you take, say, 1 billion pictures and you flip through them, you're going to see very clearly the arrow travels to the target. But in each picture, the arrow is frozen. Of course, Zeno and Aristotle didn't have the idea of movies or photographs, so they just had to imagine this. But it's the same idea as the same. How is it possible that an arrow can travel at all, given that in each moment the arrow is frozen? So Aristotle's answer to this is very short. The third that is already given above, to the effect that the flying arrow is at rest, which result falls from the assumption that time is composed of moments. This assumption is not granted, the conclusion will not follow. So Aristotle's answer to this is he just denied that when you're, yes, when you take a billion pictures of an arrow, it looks like the arrow is traveling. It looks like you've understood the arrow is traveling, but you really haven't, because he says time isn't composed of moments in that way. When you're taking a picture, you're not seeing a part of time, you're seeing something outside of time. So this is, I think, not an answer that we would particularly like now, given that we do have photographs and we have the idea of like movie frames per second. And I think the answer that a lot of people would give now is just say, yes, to some extent there is this idea of motion or momentum, that even though it's not present when you take a picture, there is some energy in the arrow that's not, that drives it to the target. So it is moving from instant to instant to instant, from frozen to frozen to frozen to target. So I think that would be the answer we'd give now. Aristotle, on the other hand, just said, I disagree with the premise. All right, John, you want to translate that quickly?
Okay. So, Trevor 他不是很满意亚里士多德给芝诺第三个悖论的一个反驳。芝诺第三个悖论其实很清楚，就是当一个弓箭手将箭射向箭靶的时候，当我们把时间做成切片，每一个小的切片它都是一个静止的一个飞时的图像，但是这个静止的图像它为什么能连续成一个运动的图景呢？就是为什么它不是一个假象，就像我们看电影一样，它其实是由无数个切片构成的一个分别静止的过程。这种连续的概念或者连续的这种流动的idea，到底是不是真的呢？芝诺可能倾向于认为这不是真的，但亚里士多德的反驳说，我们不能做这样子的区分，因为很可能我们对时间切片的剪影的集合，并不能包含整个时间序列中的所有的信息。就是当我们把时间切片的时候，这个做法本来就是一个将信息量减少的一个动作，所以它并不能代表着这些时间切片的集合，并不能代表着一个运动。然后这是我能做的最好的理解。我想这确实很不清楚，但是如果有问题，我们可以现在提出来。Everything clear or?
Yeah, everything okay? On to Zeno's fourth paradox.
对，就像切菜一样，把时间切片。
Oh, okay. All right. Good stuff. On to Zeno's fourth paradox. So Zeno actually has a couple other paradoxes beyond this. These are his four sort of important ones, four ones that we'll cover, because some of his other paradoxes are actually, they don't seem so much paradoxes as just maybe it made more sense that it's confusing to like the Greeks, but to us it just seems like math. But so this is the fourth paradox that we'll cover. So if you drop a grain of millet, it makes no sound. If you drop a ton of millet, it makes a huge sound. But a ton of millet is made up of a million grains of millet. And a grain of millet is one of these things, right? So this is probably, I don't know, a couple grams of millet. And so you can imagine you drop one of this, it's no sound. You drop like literally a ton of this, it's a huge sound. So where does the sound come from? So Aristotle's answer in this case, I think, makes a lot of sense, but it's also really, really painful to read. And for me, as like a native English speaker, it is very painful to read. So I really, yeah, just please be patient because it's very painful. All right. I'll read it, then I'll translate it, and then we'll hand it over to John. All right. So now, since wherever there's a movement, its motion always acts upon something, is always in something, and always extends to something. By is always in something, I mean that it occupies the time, and by extends to something, I mean that it involves the traversing of a certain amount of distance, for at any moment when a thing is causing motion, it also has caused motion, so that there must always be a certain amount of distance that has been traversed, and a certain amount of time that it's been occupied. Then A, the movement have moved B a distance G and a time D, then same time the same force A will move half B twice the distance G, and in half D it will move half B the whole distance for G. Thus the rules of proportion will be observed. Again, if a given force move a given weight a certain distance in a certain time and half the distance and half the time, half the motive power will move half the weight the same distance and the same time. Let E represent half the motive power A and Z half the weight B. The ratio between the motive power and the weight in the one case is similar and proportionate to the ratio in the other, so that each force will cause the same distance to be traversed in the same time. But if E moves Z a distance G in a time D, it does not necessarily follow that E can move twice Z half the distance G in the same time. It goes on. If then A move B a distance G in a time D, it does not follow that E, being half of A, will in the time D, or in any fraction of it, cause B to traverse a part of G, the ratio between which in the whole of G is proportionate to that between A and E. Whatever fraction of AE may be, in fact, it may well be that it will cause no motion at all. For it does not follow that if a given motive power causes a certain amount of motion, half that power will cause motion either of any particular amount or in any length of time. Otherwise, one man might move a ship, since both the motive power of the ship haulers and the distance that they all cause the ship to traverse are divisible into as many parts as there are men. Hence, Zeno's reasoning is false when he argues that there is no part of the millet that does not make a sound, for there is no reason why any such part should not in any length of time fail to move the air, as the whole bushel moves in falling. In fact, it does not of itself move even such a quantity of the air as it would move if this part were by itself, for no part even exists otherwise than potentially. So this is super confusing. It's Aristotle's logic, it's his terminology, potentially, mover, moving, motive power. But Aristotle's basic argument here, which makes a lot of sense and isn't that complicated, is a ship, if a bunch of men are moving a ship, one man doesn't move the ship infinitesimally. If just one guy is pulling on it, the ship isn't going to move just a little bit. Really, what happens is all the men moving together move the ship. So in the same way, he says the sound of a ton of millet falling isn't the same as the sound, isn't just the combination of one grain of millet falling. He says it's a ton moves a lot of air and hits the ground, and that's the sound. In the same way, one man doesn't move the ship a little bit, a bunch of men move the ship together. All right, so that's the very simple answer to what Aristotle is talking about. Yeah, John, do you want to?
Yes, Trevor 这里展现了一个其实是一个很糟糕的亚里士多德的一个反驳。然后芝诺的问题当然很简单，如果1吨的谷物砸到地上，它能够发出很大的声响，那1颗谷物当然发不出声响。那我们怎么能想象中间的这个断裂呢？或者说什么时候才会有最后一根稻草压的这堆谷物发出声响来呢？那 亚里士多德当然说，在理想的情况下，我们会认为有 A 的 B 推 B 的物体，然后走 C 的路线，在 D 的时间里。如果我们只有一半的力，我们只能推一半的东西走同样的路程，或者我们可以花多1倍的时间，将同样重量的物体用一半的力推一半的路程。等等的，这是理想状态的情况。但是我们实际上遇到的情况是，很多人推一架船，拉一架船是可以拉得动的，但是如果一个人，可能这个船根本就不能动。这个细分的过程，就是把千万个人分成1/1000个人的时候，其实这个拉船的这个动因或者拉船的这个能力，已经消失了，它只是潜在的存在。什么意思呢？就是一个人他其实只是作为就是能拉动船这个动因的一个潜在的一个因素，它而不能成为一个拉船动因的1/1000这样子一个严格比例的意义上，作为一个实在的或者已经发挥出来的能量来看待它。我不知道说什么，然后希望大家如果能够理解或者有不清楚的东西。对，这一块当然要先忘记掉 Newton。Okay, Newton here.
All right. So everyone understands Aristotle's answer to Zeno's fourth paradox.
He asked whether interior fact or interior reason is different from external force. So, 内因和外因，内因和外因当然不能等。什么叫内因呢？
All right, guys, if you want to,
raise it in English. So
if you want to, if you want to ask questions, first let's cover the conclusion, and then if you can ask the questions in English, because it's if not, then John has to translate, which isn't the worst thing, but it's also good for you guys to practice your English. All right. So,
so I think it's a very good question, because he asked is the potentiality different from an effective force?
Potentiality different from an effective.
Yeah, because one man is only potentiality here. One man, one force exists only in the form of potentiality. But soulless man, the force exists actually in actuality.
Okay.
Yeah.
So answering this like Aristotle would, I would say he'd say one man's force exists only in potentiality. Like one man is only can potentially move, but he's not going to be able to move it. And then his force becomes actual when it's a bunch of men working together. Then one man goes from potential to actual. Exactly, it's realized. Yeah, that is a good question. So let's go through the conclusion, and then we can cover any questions you guys have. So if we were going, as I said, at the beginning, if we're going through the history of philosophy chronologically, we'd spend, by time, we'd spend 80% of our time on Aristotle and Plato to some extent as well. Aristotle's achievements are tremendous, but it's funny that that's exactly why he ends up delaying the progress of knowledge in the Western world. And today, when we study philosophy, or science for that matter, Aristotle is more of a legacy that we have to reject than a foundation that we start with. However, he's still fascinating to read, especially because he has a very coherent worldview. Like, if you look at the way he looks at science and logic and whatever, it all fits together. It all makes sense. We might disagree with it, but we totally understand what he's coming from. But it is so strange. His ideas of physics are so strange to us. So it makes it really interesting. And next week, we're going to look at Maimonides and Thomas Aquinas, who were two of the most influential thinkers in the Aristotelian mold. Maimonides is the great Jewish philosopher, and Thomas Aquinas is the great Catholic philosopher. And we'll see how philosophy and religion mix together with them. But that is all we have today on Aristotle. So let's, if you guys have any questions, now's the time to ask them. I know there were questions earlier, so yeah, go ahead, please ask. Oh, also, while you guys are thinking of questions, not many people did their homework. I think at last check there was 4 people who handed in the homework on Socrates, and 1 person who did the Reddit, post in the Reddit thread. Whoever Rouge Sophie is, thank you very much. You're a champion. For the rest of you, you guys need to do some homework, practice your English, practice your philosophy. Like, you know, you understand it now, but in order to really get it, you need to engage with it, which means you need to do the homework. Homework for Aristotle will be going up very soon, if it's not up already, and the Reddit thread will also be going up very soon. All right. Aristotle was lost in the Middle Ages while Plato's books were kept. Was it because of war, or was it because the church didn't like Aristotle? Basically, everything has to do with it's war. It's the progress of history. I mean, occasionally you do get people who get mad at various philosophers, including Aristotle, including Plato. You do get church authorities and whatever. But the best answer is just, it's a time before the printing press. The Roman Empire collapses. You don't have the same sort of administration you had before. So that's the best reason for why Aristotle disappears for a while, and why Plato as well isn't as influential for a while. It's just the progress of history, collapse of empires. All right, good question. Any other questions? A lot of Greek works are lost during the medieval times. How could the church have acquired influence? Oh, you mean how did the church learn about the Greek works? Well, we'll find out next class. But the basic answer is the the West loses track of the Greeks, but the Middle East doesn't. And the Middle East, like the Ottoman Empire, Egyptian, whatever, they'll keep it and eventually transmit it. And the most important way that they transmit it is through what's called the Reconquista of Spain. So Spain gets conquered by the Muslims, and then the Christians come back and reconquer it. And while they're reconquering it, they learn about all these Greek philosophers, and then the Spanish help spread it to the rest of the Western world. So that's the very quick answer. For the long answer, you will have to wait until next week, which I hope you won't stay up too late thinking about it. I know it's very exciting, but sleep is important as well. All right. Any other questions? No? Oh, which part of Aristotle's ideas influenced me the most? I would say logic. I think even though my logic, or the logic I've been trained in, is far past that what Aristotle was, I mean, I still have to admit that like his emphasis on logic really changes the Western world. And in turn, like my education was very affected by that. So the present is indivisible. Oh yes. So one way to think about that, by the way, is so Aristotle sees the future as infinite, the past as infinite, and in between these two infinities is a very short, it's not even short, it's just like an indivisible, it's like a wall. Like in between two infinities is a wall, and that's what he calls the present. And so that's what his answer to that is when we're talking about, the distance equation, distance equals rate times time, he says the time part doesn't factor in because we're not part of time. Wall, a division between future and past. That's the present. Infinite past, infinite future. Yeah. And if anyone has any burning questions, ask them now. If you have a complicated question that you want serious input on, ask it on Reddit because that'll be a great use of the tool, and it'll be great to get a conversation going. All right. Good. All right, cool. See you next week, and we'll talk about Maimonides. Bye-bye.